So welcome to the technical video for General Principles of Camera Work at the Department of Film and Television at the University of Bristol. So in this I'm going to run through some of the terminology you're going to encounter whatever the cameras that you're using are, and also some ideas around exposure and also terms such as log and LUT, try and give a bit of an explanation to them. So to start with, I like to think of image capture as consisting of three elements, and the first element really is the lens, and that's where the light enters the lens, travels through glass and then passes to the next element, which is the sensor, and the third element is the record unit itself, but the first element is always the lens. Now there are different qualities of engineering, of precision and materials, and they can cost anything from a few £100 to £25,000 a prime lens. So I shot a feature documentary on Sky Television called Kids Like Us, and our lens package was 11 lenses and they were valued at about £550,000 for insurance. Now why is that? Well, it's to do with the quality of the materials, the qualities of the glass, but also the precision of the engineering. However, the lenses that we'll be using cost maybe £1,500, £2,000, but they're absolutely perfectly fine for everything that you'll be doing. Now the second element in the image capture is actually the sensor itself, and that is the element that transfers the light information into ones and zeros that kick out the back of the sensor. So when you were filming on film itself, you only had two elements. You just had the lens and then the film, and that was it. When it comes to sensors, you have the lens, then the sensor, then the record unit. And the sensor is the thing that translates that light into digital information. Now, you've probably heard talk of raw images, for instance. Well, a raw image is quite simply when you are recording all of the ones and zeros that come out of the sensor without changing them at all. But that creates huge data files, and we'll come on to Codecs and the solution for that a bit later on. But when it comes to sensors, you have different sizes, different sensitivities, different technologies, and different resolutions. So you've probably heard of talk of high definition or of 4K, and that's all to do with the resolution, the number of pixels that there are. And you could have sensors that are 35mm or sensors that are 65mm or smaller sensors, 2/3 of an inch chip sensors. So there's lots and lots of variation in this, and then there's also lots of variation in terms of the technology itself, how that light is transformed into digital information. The third element of capturing an image, well, on film it would have been the film cell, and so you wouldn't have had this third stage. But in digital, which is how you are going to be recording your images, you have the recorder, which is the third element in the chain. Lens, sensor, recorder. So film captures an image chemically, the recorder captures digital information. So you've probably heard talk of codecs and compression. Well, what does this mean? I mentioned earlier, a raw image on a digital camera is very simply all of the ones and zeros are preserved. When it comes to the amount of data that creates, you're looking at huge files. And when you're working, especially maybe on a documentary, but also in terms of how you're going to edit, you simply don't need that much data on the whole. And most of the raw recording we do in film and television would be for extremely high-end projects, feature films, commercials, potentially if you're doing special effects. On the whole, you'll want to compress that image and make the data much smaller, and that's when codecs come in. So a codec means compression and decompression, and it's basically a form of algorithm that tries to preserve as much data as possible, as much information as possible, whilst making the size of the data as small as possible. So the analogy that I often use is of a duvet. So say you've got a nice big thick winter double duvet and you want to put it away for the summer. If you put that into a bag and try and put it in the cupboard, it's quite bulky and big, and that would be as if you were sort of using raw. If you weren't squishing any of the air out of it, it would be too bulky to actually go in the cupboard. So what you might want to do is get a smaller bag. So rather than using the big bag, which is the raw data, you might want a slightly smaller bag, and you're crushing that duvet into the smaller bag. Now, you're not changing the fundamental characteristic of that duvet, you're just putting it into a smaller packet. So hopefully when you unfold it, it's still pretty much the same duvet when it comes time to change it back for winter. However, if you need to save even more space because your cupboard's full of stuff, you might want to use an even smaller bag. Now here you'll have to make a choice about, actually, do you have to take some of the stuffing out to get it in there? And that's really the analogy for a codec. The smaller you make the data, the more you compress it, the more information you're going to have to start throwing away. And it's quite obvious that if you start taking feathers out of your feather duvet, when you come to the winter and want it back on your bed, it's not going to be the same duvet that you had last year. So that's a kind of very basic analogy for how compression works. The basic idea is I want to preserve as much information as possible about the light, about the color, about all of that information in the image, but I want it to be as small as possible. Another analogy that I often use, because most people have come across cars, is this is a Ford Fiesta, right? It's £20,000. It's got a top speed of 144 miles per hour. It's 152 brake horsepower. Frankly, I know nothing about cars, so I have no idea what brake horsepower is, but it sounds pretty good. This is a great car, family car, or maybe you want to go camping with your mates, commute to work. It's ideal. This car is a Bugatti Veyron. Now this is about 3 million. It's got a top speed of 268 miles per hour, and it's got brake horsepower of 1,148. Again, I have no idea what that means, but I'm assuming it's good. So this is not the kind of car you want to go camping in, right? And also the other thing is, if this is getting flung around a circuit like, you know, a Grand Prix circuit, I'm probably not going to get in it with a 20-year-old who's passed their test a couple of years ago, unless it's sort of Max Verstappen, who's been doing go-karts since he was about 4. It's a performance vehicle and it needs handling as such. You need to know how to drive it. And I guess this is where the analogy comes in. If we compare the two, a Ford Fiesta and a Bugatti Veyron, if I take the engine out of the Bugatti Veyron and put it on the Ford Focus, it's not going to make the Ford Focus into a Bugatti Veyron. Likewise, you know, if the engine is like the lens and the steering wheel is like the sensor and the brakes are like the recorder on the camera, you change those between these two cars, it's not going to make the cars perform better necessarily. You know, with the FX6s that you'll be using, you can put really good lenses on there and it will sustain a great image. But on the whole, you have to think about not only about the quality of the equipment that you're using, but what you're using it for. Again, I wouldn't want to go camping in a Bugatti Veyron. There's nowhere to put the tent and the sleeping bags. Probably don't want to be racing a Ford Fiesta on a Grand Prix circuit against other high-performance vehicles. So that's a kind of analogy on how you think about it. You don't always need to worry about having the best of the best. It's about the tool that you require for the job you're doing. So we come to exposure, and some of you may have heard of the exposure triangle. It's used in photography really to kind of talk about how we get exposure and how we calculate exposure. And you'll see along one side is aperture, along the other side is shutter, along the bottom is ISO or light sensitivity. Now, ISO, or gain as it's sometimes referred to on digital cameras, is effectively a way of boosting the signal. All of the cameras will have a base ISO. The Sony FX6, for instance, has a base ISO of 800. If you change the ISO, and you look here, you know, if you've got an ISO of 800 and then you make the ISO 100, it will make the exposure darker. And if you go upwards, you know, to 12,800, it will make the exposure much brighter. But what you're also doing is you're changing the quality of the image because you are adding noise. Okay, that's a big problem when you come to scenes, especially if you are changing the ISO in scene. Basically, the general principle is don't fiddle with ISO if you can avoid it at all. If you are going to use ISO, be aware that it will put artifacts and noise into the images, and when you come to edit it, you're going to have to spend a bit of time cleaning that up. Likewise, if you're cutting between images with different ISOs, it's not going to match and you're going to have to work really hard. So the next thing is shutter, and this is often referred to by speed or angle. The reason it's referred to by angle is because in the original film cameras, you had a physical shutter that would rotate. And what would happen is the film cell would drop in and the shutter would rotate, and while the shutter's closed, the next film cell drops in, the shutter clears and you get exposure, and then it closes, the next film cell drops in, it clears and exposes, and that's how it worked. It was a mechanical shutter. So that has left a hangover from the film days where sometimes people refer to 180-degree shutter. And that's what it should be set at. If you are shooting at 25 frames per second, the camera is open for half the time, closed for half the time. So when you're shooting 25 frames per second and you're using a 180-degree shutter, it's effectively exposing the image for 1/50th of a second. And that's when you'd refer to it by speed. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because the electric cycles in Britain and the UK and Europe are different to America. In the UK and Europe, we use 50 hertz, and in America, they use 60 hertz. So we tend to shoot at 25 frames per second and a 50th on the shutter because it means that that matches with our electric cycle. If you took our cameras at 25 frames per second to America, you'd see them strobing. So you'd actually have to change the shutter speed to a 60th of a second to avoid the strobing on the image. And that's why the Americans shoot at 30 frames per second. But for the purposes of the film and TV department at the University of Bristol, we shoot at 25 frames per second. And you can change the shutter. You could go to a higher shutter speed, 500th or 250, or you could go to a lower shutter speed. It will change the image, however. A higher shutter speed means less blur on the image, a sharper image, and a slower shutter means more blur. So just be aware that you are using it as an effect, but the most common application would be potentially filming a very high speed car, something like a Bugatti Veyron. You might want a higher shutter speed to make the image a little crisper. So that's shutter. The next or third element is aperture. And you'll see here the aperture is referred to in f-stops. And the higher the number, the smaller the aperture. So if we go to f1.4, the smallest number here, you have a very wide aperture. And as you go through towards f22, the aperture becomes smaller and smaller. Now that does have an impact on the image because the wider the aperture, the softer the background will be on the whole. And as you go into the higher apertures, you'll get a sharper image. And that's to do with the depth of field. So on a wider aperture, you'll have much less of the image is actually in focus. So if I'm in focus, the focus might start slightly in front of me and end slightly behind my head. When I'm shooting on a higher aperture, f22, much deeper range of the image will be in focus, so it will affect your image. So you can use aperture to control your exposure, but it will change the quality of the image. And in terms of the exposure triangle, if we think about that, you have ISO, you have shutter, and you have aperture. So you can't change shutter because it changes the quality of the image. You don't really want to use ISO because that changes the quality of the image. That leaves you with aperture. But also on these cameras that you'll be using, there is neutral density filters to make the image darker if you're working with a bright image. However, if the image is too dark, you probably need to rethink and think about lighting. So that's aperture and image exposure. The next thing to think about is lenses, and this video here very clearly demonstrates there's two things to think about primarily with lenses. First is the field of view, and when we're talking about a wide angle lens, it's about how much of the image in front of you you're seeing. 170 degrees, for instance. A longer lens might have a much tighter range of field of view in terms of the image that you're seeing in front of you. A wide lens might have 170 degrees of field of view, whereas a longer lens like a 200mm will have a much narrower field of view. You're not seeing anything off to the sides. And that's clearly demonstrated here. You can see the face is the same size, but as you cycle through the lenses, the wider lens is seeing more background, and the tighter lenses on longer lenses seeing less background. The other thing it affects is the focus. On the whole, the wider the lens, the more is in focus. The tighter the lens, the less is in focus in terms of the depth of field. So we talk about depth of field, and we also talk about angle of view. So you may have heard people talk about log and LUT. What is a log? Well, log is a way of retaining, again like a codec, as much information about the image as possible. And in order to do that, it actually makes the image look very grey and flat and unattractive. That's the best way to record because it preserves a lot more detail, especially in the bright areas. You'll see on this photograph here with the climbers, there's a lot of detail in the shadowy side of the rock. Then a LUT is a look-up table, and it's a bit like using a JPEG on your stills camera, I suppose. It's a much more natural image, okay? The blues are more like what you would expect. All of the colours are more like you would expect. And in terms of moving image cameras, the log will look grey and murky and ugly, and the LUT will ping and really sing. So I encourage you to use a LUT in the viewfinder, but please make sure you're not burning that LUT into the image itself because it's very different to fix afterwards. So always shoot on log, try and use a LUT on the viewfinder to see what the image might look like. The thing to be aware of is that when you do use the LUT, so the image looks nicer, you'll have a lot less detail in the highlights, and at the top end, especially the sky, will often burn out. And it's worth, if you have an image where the sky looks very bright and burnt out, what you might want to do is just switch between the log and the LUT to check whether the detail is there in the image. So here's another example. This is a log image. It's much flatter and grayer, a lot more information, but a LUT has a truer look. It's more like what we would expect to see in the final image. Now, why do we use the log? Well, the reason we use log is because of something called dynamic range. And dynamic range is the amount of information between total black and total white on the image. The human eye can see thousands of variations all the way from black right up to the very brightest white. And when you're moving through spaces from a very dark interior to a very bright exterior, your eyes are constantly adjusting to that. Well, cameras are recording information digitally, and they don't have as much detail in terms of brightness and darkness and the range between black and white as the human eye does. So that's when we talk about dynamic range. The cameras will tend to have a dynamic range when you're in log of 15 to 20 stops. When you put a LUT on, it reduces the dynamic range a lot. You basically have a lot less information in the bright area, about 4 or 5 stops less information in the bright area than you do using a log. And that's the reason we shoot on log, is to preserve that dynamic range. The other thing that you need to think about in capturing images is the color balance. Now, if you look out of a window on an overcast day, it's a much cooler light that's coming through that window, a much bluer light. And we refer to the quality of light in terms of degrees Kelvin, or K. So, for instance, a cold overcast day might be 7,000 K. A normal day might be 5,000 to 6,000. And if you're looking at a domestic lamp inside, you're probably looking at something around 3,000 Kelvin. And you could even go warmer than that, or somewhere in the middle, about 4,300. The reason that this matters is because if you're shooting in mixed light, you have a very blue window and you have a very orange lamp in the room at the same time, you will have real trouble in post-production matching those. So if you try and make the window a bit warmer, it's not just going to make the cool light warmer, it's also going to make the yellow light much warmer. Likewise, if you try and cool the lamp down and make it a bit bluer, you're now going to make the window light very, very blue. So you really need to think about the image that you're capturing and think about the color balance, not only where you set it, but how you frame your shot to avoid too much of that kind of mixed light that might cause you problems further down the line. So now we come on to how to shoot. And this is not a camera, it's a hose. And the reason I'm showing a hose is because a camera is not a hose, okay? If you're watering the garden, you're spraying the water everywhere, you're trying to get every patch of lawn covered. And I quite often see people starting out using cameras and they're using the camera like a hose. It's wandering all over the place, it doesn't fix, it doesn't let people enter or leave frame. It's just kind of following the action randomly. Hose is great for watering the garden. It's not the principle you want to use when you're actually filming. I tend to use an internal stopwatch, and this is something I've been doing for 25 years and I'm still doing it. It doesn't become automatic. Quite often you've got a director shouting at you, come on, we've got to go, we need to move on to the next shot. And if you are filming some shots, for instance, of a cityscape, and you rush those shots, they're going to be useless for the editor. So you actually need to slow yourself down and count. Now, if you were doing a pan, let's say you're on a shot of two people over here and you're going to pan to the left, I'm using that stopwatch internally and I'm counting. Starting off on these two people here, I'm counting down 15 seconds, okay? 15, 14, 13, 11, 12. Only when I hit 0 do I pan. And then when I get to that end, I don't just end the shot and move on. I then hold that shot and I give it a count again, 15 seconds. Now I've given the editor 3 shots. The starting shot of these people over here, the pan, and the end shot of these two people over here. And you want to use that as a matter of principle all the time. Use the stopwatch to count. If you've got two people talking, you don't want to stay on one person for the whole conversation because then you won't have your reverses or your responses and you won't have any 2 shots. So when you're filming documentary, you're always listening and you're starting on the single. You might move and develop to a 2 shot. You might then move to the second person. Now this person's saying something that's quite interesting, so I'm going to move there. Oh, now they're saying something that's not interesting, but I'm going to use that time to get a reverse shot. So you're always counting, but don't hold on that shot of that person talking forever and ever. Think about 20 to 25 seconds, because when it comes to the edit, you're never going to use those shots for a very long time, unless that's part of the style of the program and it's a conscious decision. So the stopwatch is a great tool. And why are you doing that? It's because you are editing as you shoot and you're thinking about delivering it to the edit. Ultimately, as a camera person, an operator or a DOP, you are thinking about delivering material to the edit. So, for example, I often talk about zooming out for context and zooming in for detail, and I don't mean on the lens here, I mean in terms of the scene. So here's an example. So this is a casino in Vegas, and the scene we were filming was actually a chap who was addicted to gambling and was coming here with a therapist to try and overcome that addiction. It's quite a tragic story. And obviously we're taking them to a casino, so we're taking them somewhere that's pretty harmful to them, a bit like taking an alcoholic to a pub. But basically, we had a restriction on us. We could only film there between 2 and 6 in the morning, and the person could only come between 4 and 6 in the morning with the therapist. So when I arrived, I started off by making sure I had all of the context. I was zoomed out for context. Big wides, some exteriors of the casino, but big wides of all the tables and everybody gambling, and getting that from a lot of different angles. Don't just stay in one place, move around the space. Then after that, I moved on to maybe closer mid shots, people gambling, throwing dice, dealing cards, these kind of mid shots, some of them in slow motion, some of them in standard 25 frames per second. And now I've got the kind of context, and now I've got the action. And I also spend some time on some real detail, like extreme close-ups of dice being thrown, cards going down on the table. So I've got my wide scenes, my context, I've now got my mid scenes, and I've now got my detail. And I've still got a bit of time before a contributor arrives, so I go looking for character, like this lady who's busy smoking cigarettes whilst she's got an oxygen tank and gambling away at 3 o'clock in the morning. And who knows what her story is, but she's certainly an interesting character. So now I start looking for those kind of character details or interesting moments. What that means is that when our contributor does arrive, and we've got 2 hours with them, I've already got everything I need to edit the sequence. I've got wides for context, I've got mid shots, I've got extreme details. So I might do some shots of our contributor as they arrive. But because there's a sensitivity around and safeguarding, what I'm actually going to do is just hang back and let them come into the space with the therapist and go through the process with the therapist. As they become more comfortable, I might move in, but on the whole, I'm being very sensitive and just concentrating now on making sure I've captured the dialogue between the contributor and their therapist. So I've spent 2 hours thinking about my context, my wides, the building, but also the space that they're in, and then the mid shots, the people, and then the details, the close-ups, and then the character shots as well. So now I've filmed for 2 hours with that, 2 hours with the contributor, and I know I've delivered all of the shots that are going to be required for the editors to do their job. So thanks for watching. That was General Principles of Camera Work. Please watch the technical video for the camera that you're going to use relative to the year you're in, and enjoy your shoots.